Consul-General Schuette joined the German Foreign Service in 1981 and has served as Deputy Head of Division for Middle East Affairs and Head of Division for Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova. He also has served in the German embassies in Moscow, Tel Aviv, and Rome, as well as in the German mission to the United Nations in New York. Consul General Schuette has written and spoken extensively about contemporary German-Jewish relations at numerous synagogues and Jewish centers and universities during his lecture tour through the United States in 1996, as well as during his tenure in San Francisco. As a visiting scholar at the American Jewish Committee in New York, during his sabbatical in 2004 or 5, he completed his important work on German-Jewish relations today, which was published by the American Jewish Committee. Please let me introduce to you German Consul-General Rolf Schuette, who will talk to you about the Holocaust's role in the identity of today's Germans.
Guten Abend. Zunächst einmal möchte ich alle begrüßen, die Deutsch sprechen und die Deutsch studiert haben und an dieser wunderbaren Universität heute Deutschkurse belegen. Ich weiß, das sind einige hier im Raum, die auch meine Muttersprache verstehen, aber es gibt noch einige wenige, die noch nicht diese guten Deutschkurse belegt haben. Deshalb werde ich jetzt auf Englisch fortfahren. Good evening, and I'm very happy to be back at OSU here in Corvallis. I had the privilege of visiting this university about a year and a half ago, and I'm happy to see also some of the students that are studying German at this university, and I was just greeting them in German because at that time I said that it makes much sense to learn German, but that's not my topic here tonight. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Jonathan Katz for inviting me to speak here tonight and to speak in the framework of Oregon State University's annual Holocaust Memorial Remembrance on this April the 22nd, the very day which is known as the Day of Remembrance, or in Hebrew, Yom HaShoah. I think it is natural, it's not the most natural thing in the world that you have invited me, the official representative of Germany in the American Northwest, as a German, to speak on the very day when the Holocaust is remembered as the state-sponsored systematic persecution and annihilation of European Jewry by Nazi Germany and its collaborators. Even though these crimes were committed between 1933 and 1945, that is more than 6 decades ago, I understand that it may not have been easy for some of you present here tonight, especially for Holocaust survivors or their descendants, to make the decision to come and to listen to me, to a German, speaking at this event. Especially to those, thank you for coming. My topic tonight is the Holocaust's role in the identity of today's Germans. At the outset, let me underline that I am not a speaker that belongs to the group of what in the brochure for this program are called the, and I quote, best known and most original researchers in the field of Holocaust studies. Neither will I speak to you only as the official representative of Germany on the West Coast. Today, I actually would prefer to address you more as a German citizen who is very interested in German-Jewish relations, speak from my personal observations in Israel and in the United States and in Germany, and less so in my official capacity. The time available for me for addressing this important and difficult question is very limited, especially as I would like to leave some time for questions and answers after my talk. So if you're interested, it was mentioned that when I was a visiting scholar at the American Jewish Committee in New York, the American Jewish Committee published a little brochure that I wrote on the subject of German-Jewish relations. You may find it, it is published by the AJC, but you could also find it on the webpage of the German Consulate in San Francisco. When addressing the question of how important the Holocaust is for the identity of Germans today, we have to first look at the following set of interrelated questions. What do Germans know about the Holocaust? How do they learn about it? And how do they relate to it? So the first question is, what do Germans know about the Holocaust today? And I would like to relate to polls, because individual personal perceptions are one thing, but statistical data are usually more reliable. And the polls show that 89% of all Germans today know their past quite well. Maybe not all the details of what happened during the Holocaust, but basically the substance. The main difference for Germans today is not what they know, but how are they relating to the Holocaust themselves against this historical background. Second question is, how do Germans learn about the Holocaust? If Germans know about the Holocaust quite well, how have they learned about it? More than 60 years after the end in 1945. To answer this question, let me start with a quote. And I quote, "Most countries celebrate the best in their pasts. Germany unrelentingly promotes its worst. The enormous Holocaust memorial that dominates a chunk of central Berlin was completed only after years of debate. But the building of monuments to the Nazi disgrace continues unabated. On Monday, Germany's Minister of Culture announced that the construction could begin in Berlin on two other monuments, one near the Reichstag to the murdered gypsies, known here as the Sinti and Roma, and another one not far from the Brandenburg Gate to gays and lesbians killed in the Holocaust. In November, Germany broke ground on the long-delayed Topography of Terror, center at the site of the former Gestapo and SS headquarters. And in October, a huge exhibition opened at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. At the Dachau camp outside Munich, a new visitor center is set to open this summer. The city of Erfurt is planning a museum dedicated to the crematoriums. There are currently 2 exhibitions about the role of the German railways in delivering millions to their deaths." End of quote. This quote is from an article in the New York Times of January last year and was titled, "Germany Confronts Holocaust Legacy Anew." So from this quote by an American journalist, you may conclude that Holocaust remembrance is omnipresent in Germany. And that is true. As I said before, it is also true that most Germans know quite well what happened during the Nazi years, and yet there are many challenges. The main challenge is, how do we remember the Holocaust at a time when there are less and less witnesses who can give personal testimony? And there are several aspects that I would like to mention. On the one hand, there are memorial days, like the one that we are having here today. Also memorial days in Germany, when the highest representatives of the German government and the state address the issue. One annual such event since 1996 is January 27, when in Germany, what here in the United States is called Holocaust Remembrance Day today, same as in Israel, Germany has a Holocaust Remembrance Day on January 27th, which is the day when the Auschwitz concentration camp was liberated. On that day, the flags on public buildings in Germany are flown half-mast. A ceremony is held in the Bundestag. This year, our president, Köhler, gave the main speech. Another such day of remembrance in Germany is November 9th. November 9th is the day of what is called Reichskristallnacht, the day of broken glass or crystal night, other words for it. Last year, our Chancellor Merkel addressed the audience on this day in the new synagogue in Rilkestraße in Berlin. So these memorial days are one way to learn about the Holocaust today. But second, the Nazi years and the developments that led to them are also taught very intensively in German schools, in the German curricula. Then the media still deal with aspects of the Nazi rule and the Holocaust intensively, especially our political magazines like Der Spiegel. You would be surprised how many times you see Der Spiegel with a cover story on certain aspects of the Nazi past. The media still deal with aspects of Nazi rule and the Holocaust very intensively. Many films cover the period, in addition to our local productions for our public TV, cinema. There are, of course, the international movies like Schindler's List, Nowhere in Africa, The Forfeiters, or The Reader now, that you can see in the theaters right now, or Valkyrie, that are also very popular in Germany. Then I would like to mention exhibitions. I already, in that article that I quoted in the New York Times, it was mentioned that there is a big central Holocaust memorial in Berlin, right in the very center of the city, near the Brandenburg Gate and near our Parliament building. And that memorial attracted 3.5 million visitors in the first year when it was opened. There's also a new Jewish museum in Berlin, and that attracted 5 million visitors in the first 6 years, and in 2008, a record of 758,000 visitors. It makes it the second most popular museum in Berlin, which I can assure you is not poor in museums. So it shows that there is a great interest on the part of large sections of the German society in Jewish history, in especially German Jewish history, and the Holocaust, which is a part of that history. Then we have, of course, I mentioned that there is the Central Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, and many people, especially Americans, when I talk about this subject, they ask me, here in America, almost every city has a Holocaust museum or Holocaust memorial, but in Germany we do not have that. Why is that so? Because the reason is that we only have one central Holocaust memorial because we are the country where the crimes were committed. So our approach basically is that we should preserve the original sites of the Holocaust, like the concentration camps, but also, let's say, the locations where the Holocaust began, where the Jews were assembled to be deported to the concentration camps in the East or in Germany. And so it is our approach to keep those original sites of the Holocaust in order so it can be visited and people can at first hand inform themselves of what happened. And we dedicate quite a lot of money, not only to the upkeep of the concentration camp inside Germany, but also, for example, to the one in Auschwitz in Poland. There's even an international cooperation on Holocaust remembrance today. It has a very complicated title. It's called the Secretariat of the Task Force for International Cooperation on Holocaust Education, Remembrance and Research. And that is an international body made up of 25 states, but Germany wanted to have that body, that secretariat in Germany, and it is now located in Berlin. Some observers even claim, and that's a critical point, that there is an overdose of Holocaust-related material in the public discussion, that there is a fear of what is called Holocaust fatigue, and that it may be counterproductive, especially for younger people, if they're exposed to too much Holocaust remembrance. That's a subject that one can discuss, but I would like to mention it. Especially many younger people in Germany, born decades after the Holocaust ended, and many people living in Germany of foreign origin are a particular challenge in this context. Members of both groups claim that they have little to do with events that ended more than 60 years ago. And against this very background, there is a general view in Germany that new forms and methods have to supplement the traditional forms of Holocaust remembrance. Thus, the German federal and state and local governments and city governments and other official organizations support initiatives coming from civil society which are innovative to keep the Holocaust remembrance alive. I cannot mention all of them. I just want to mention a few of these initiatives. There is something that in German is called Stolpersteine and would be translated as stumbling blocks. If you go into German cities like Berlin or other cities, you would find on the pavements, you would find little signs, little stumbling blocks, cinders, where there are names and dates of people that lived in the houses. And these are the Jews that lived in the houses before the Nazis took power. So to make the history more personal, to connect not only numbers, there's number 6 million Jews perished in the Holocaust, but people understand that that's not sufficient. You have to make history personal to make it more adaptable for people today. So there are these stumbling blocks, or there are signs on buildings where it's the people that lived, the Jews that lived in those buildings are remembered in those years. There are also exhibitions that in many little towns where only very few people lived, Jewish people lived, and civil society groups come together, students, young people from schools. I just, last week I visited my own hometown and I found that which I didn't know, the town where I was born, that during the Nazi years there were only 50 Jews living in that town, but there is a little memorial there, and they mention all the names, and they mention exactly when they were born, what their profession was, and where they perished in the Holocaust. That's just very typical. Or in universities or colleges, for example, the students that study architecture, they study, what did the people in their architectural students in the Nazi period, what did they do? How many of them were Jewish? And so the occupational groups develop their own histories in that sense. And there are many different other examples which come from civil society. And we understand that the government approach to Holocaust remembrance is one thing, but it is probably more important to give it a personal aspect, and that these initiatives that come from civil society may be much more important in the long run. One of the aspects that is one of the projects that was supported by German federal government money is what is called the residence lists. And it's a list of all the German Jews that lived in Germany before 1933 or between 1933 and 45, and it's now completed. It's the complete list of all Jews living in Germany, and a few months ago the complete list was given to the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem in Israel and to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. So against this background, my third question is, how do today's Germans relate to what they know, and how important is it for their identity? I would like to distinguish three main groups and three approaches. The first is the approach of what I would call the radical right-wing fringe. Maybe you can also call them the NeoNazis and their mentors. Sometimes people ask, how big is this group? And it's very difficult to say. If you take the electoral results, we have a party which I would call a neo-Nazi party that gets in national elections, in the last national elections, gets 1.6% of the vote. So that may not sound very much, but it's too much. And in some parts of East Germany especially, the numbers, the percentage is much higher. I would say that this is a group, the neo-Nazi group, the right-wing fringe, and their sympathizers. They also know what happened, but they just pretend not to know, and for political reasons. They deny the Holocaust in a certain way, the similar way that the Iranian president does. You may have followed in the papers today that there was a conference yesterday in Geneva on racism, and the Iranian president participated and made again these horrendous statements about denial of Holocaust and so on. And I would say that's a similarity. I do believe, I don't know him personally, but I do believe that the Iranian president knows very well what happened in the Holocaust, and so do these neo-Nazis in Germany, but they deny it for political reasons. The second group in the German society, I would say maybe 2/3 or 3/4 of the German society, I would characterize their attitude as that they feel some kind of collective shame for what happened, for the crimes that were committed by Germans during the Nazi years, but they feel no personal guilt, which is not surprising because to feel a personal guilt you would have today to be more than 85 years old, even to be theoretically implicated in any crimes committed during the Holocaust. But this feeling of collective shame is a very important thing. And what is amazing is that over the years there were polls taken, how do people feel? How do feel about the Holocaust? And amazingly that the feeling of collective shame increased over the years since the first polls were taken in 1991. Nevertheless, also this group resents being lectured about it. I mentioned before that there is a guilt fatigue, and even collective shame is a heavy burden. And 58% of the people also say that in a certain way there should be what we call a Schlussstrich, a final line, which is interesting because today I read the results of a poll that was taken in Israel. And in Israel today, 31% of all Israelis think that the Holocaust is not a reason for a special German commitment to Israel. I'm very surprised about the high percentage. But this is aside, I'm not going to talk about Israel or American Jewry, but about German question of identity. But coming back to that large majority of Germans living today, I think their identity is determined by Germany's decent present and not so much by its shameful past. This group, this large majority, believes that the lessons were learned and they are reflected in our daily life, in a tolerant society, for example, but also in many political decisions. And I would like to give you two examples, which are, I think, very indicative of this. One example is from domestic policies. We have here in the American Northwest, also in Oregon and in Washington, we have a debate about euthanasia and assisted suicide. And Oregon, as far as I know, is the first state in the United States where it's legalized. There is a debate like that in Europe too, in Switzerland and in the Netherlands. It's also legitimate. In Germany, we have a debate about it, but when you follow the debate, in addition to all the ethical and moral arguments that you would also find here in the United States, for and against, or in the Netherlands or in Switzerland in Europe, in Germany it's always the question, what do the Nazi years teach us about this issue? How can we in Germany approach this with our particular background of euthanasia used by the Nazis? So there is an additional element. I would like to give you another example from foreign policy. You may remember that 2 years ago there was the war between Israel and Lebanon. And after this war between Hezbollah and Israel, there was the question, how can you stabilize the peace? And the international community came to the conclusion that it would be good to have an international observer mission on the borders between Israel and Lebanon. And of course, in Germany, there was a long debate in the parliament and in the political party, because being implied in this kind of international force might mean that eventually a German soldier might have to shoot at an Israeli soldier, which is also a Jew. And that was reflecting, is that possible? Is that conceivable after all that happened during the Holocaust? The result was of this discussion only came about at the time when the Israeli government asked the German government to please get involved in this mission, because we trust you more than most of the other European countries. So Germans should be there. And that only turned around the political debate about this in the German parliament and made it possible for a German contingent in that force. Another issue I want to mention is, for example, what lessons do Germans and Jews draw from the Holocaust in terms of the use of force? In polls, 58% in Germany are against the use of force in international relations as a legitimate means for international policy. So a large majority is against the use of force. Germany in many ways is a very pacifist country, which found it very difficult to get involved in Afghanistan, for example. However, in Israel, 83%, or among American Jews, 84% do think that the use of force is a legitimate means in international policy if it's under the right conditions. So it's very interesting. It's both a reflection of the past. The reflection of the past for Germans is never again war, and the consequence and the conclusion for many Jews is never again victims. So from the same past, you can come to completely different conclusions in political decisions. I don't want to go into many more details about this, but the relationship with Israel is one of the aspects that I might want to mention. Germany today is considered by Israel, by Israeli government, the best friend internationally after the United States. And again, coming to the conference that happened yesterday in Geneva, you may have read that a number of countries did not participate in the conference. The United States was one of them. And in Europe, out of the 27 European Union member states, only 5 states stayed away from the conference because they feared that it would turn into a kind of anti-Israeli tribunal. And among them was Germany, was Italy, was Great Britain, and Poland, and all the 20 other European member states did participate. This can only be understood against the background of the very particular German past. So, to sum up, this group, this vast majority of Germans, see Germany as a normal country, like other European countries today. But it still is somewhat a special country because 2 years ago we had the World Soccer Championship in Germany, and people were most surprised that for the first time in German post-war histories, younger Germans went out into the streets with German flags, which is quite normal. I mean, just look around, there are American flags here everywhere, and in other European countries it's the same. In Germany, that was quite unusual. And it's not a sign of, nationalism or something, but it's something like patriotism like in other countries, but it was the first time ever that younger Germans kind of associated themselves with their own country after the war. So that may be a process, and it doesn't have to lead to any kind of nationalism, but it's a kind of normalization in feeling towards their own identity. Now the third group, I mentioned the first group, 5% maybe neo-Nazis, then 2/3, 3/4, 2/3 of the population, the ones that I just talked about, and then a last group of 20%, maybe 1/5, is feeling a feeling of personal guilt for what happened in the Holocaust, even though even they cannot be directly involved in any crime. And I would say that there are different aspects to this group. Some are very genuine, they are volunteers and in concentration camps and in German Jewish understanding groups, but there is also some part, I would say, is reflecting a kind of political correctness. So let me draw some conclusions before you all fall asleep with a couple of theses. First, even though most Germans today have never met a Jew in person, and let alone a Holocaust survivor, they know quite well about the Holocaust through the curricula at school, TV, films, and other media, also memorials and memorial days, museums, and days of remembrance. Second, most Germans feel a collective shame but don't like to be reminded or lectured of the past, especially not from abroad. They believe that Germany knows and has drawn the right lessons from its history, that Germany is a decent country today. And when you look at the international polls that are taken by BBC, for example, about the popularity of countries, we are of course very happy that Germany is now topping the list of popular countries in the world. So that gives the Germans that do see themselves as a decent country also some kind of reflection in international popularity. Germans know that history cannot be rolled back, but they must not forget and must live the lessons of their history in their daily life today. But all responsible persons also know that innovative approaches must be pursued and strengthened to keep the Holocaust memory not only alive, but productive for future generations. And the examples that I gave you about activities in civil societies are probably more important than anything else. I would like to quote our president, who on German Holocaust Remembrance Day on January 27th this year said something that I think sums it up very well. And I quote him, he says, "The responsibility incumbent on us because of the Shoah forms part of our identity as Germans. Our mourning for the victims, our deep shame over the horrible deeds, and our will to achieve reconciliation with the Jewish people and with those who were once our enemies in war, all this brings us to the roots of our republic. The dignity of man is inviolable." End of quote. Thus, the Holocaust memory is as important for most Germans as it is for most Jews. It is a very important factor in personal and collective identity, as the most harrowing experience in Jewish and German history. For Germans, it is also something that has been described as a constitutive element of present-day political culture in Germany. Thus, it may sound strange, but I think you can argue that the Holocaust is an element that both separates and binds Germans and Jews like probably no other two peoples. It creates a very special relationship, even for those that would rather not speak of it or would rather speak of normalcy today. However, the Holocaust as a topic is very seldom directly addressed in a dialogue when a German and a Jew meet. But even if they don't talk about it, when they realize you are German, you are Jewish, it is omnipresent because it's in people's minds somewhere on the back of their head. Thus, I think, summing up, coming to an end, an event like this today, when a German addresses an audience with many Jewish participants on the question of the Holocaust, is all but the most natural thing in the world. And once again, therefore, let me thank you for having been given the opportunity to talk with you about this subject here tonight. Thank you.